2 aircraft carriers already hit. The Fifth Fleet retreated to the Indian Ocean. 20% of the world's oil, completely blocked, not by a storm, not by an equipment failure, by a deliberate act of military power. And China is watching quietly and not saying very much at all. The energy markets, military strategists, and currency economists will be analyzing for decades. And Trump just ordered the U.S. Navy back in. This is either a masterstroke or the most dangerous gamble of the decade. As of 10 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, U.S. Central Command confirmed that American naval forces have begun intercepting all maritime traffic entering or leaving Iranian ports. Ships that pay Iran for passage through the strait will also be stopped on the open sea. This is not a warning. The blockade is active right now. Iran responded within hours. The Revolutionary Guard made clear that if Iranian ports face threat, no port in the Persian Gulf or the Sea of Oman will be safe for anyone. That is not a negotiating position. That is a threat to shut down the energy supply for the entire region, including American allies like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE. Here is what you need to understand before anything else. This strait, 21 nautical miles at its narrowest, carries roughly a fifth of all seaborne oil on the planet and 20% of global liquefied natural gas. It has been effectively closed since late February. What changed today is that now America is enforcing that closure on its own terms against Iran. The collision course is set. Oil prices have already surged past $120 a barrel. Analysts at the Quincy Institute are now warning that a sustained blockade could push that to $150. To put that in terms you feel directly, U.S. gas prices hit $4 a gallon by the end of March, a 30% surge. And that was before today. The pain is not evenly distributed. Gulf states Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE rely on the strait for over 80% of their food imports. Grocery prices there have spiked between 40% and 120%. Desalination plants providing nearly all drinking water in Kuwait and Qatar have been struck. This is not an abstract economic story. People cannot find food or water. Pakistan is facing severe fuel shortages. Bangladesh, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Vietnam are in crisis. The Philippines declared a state of emergency. Europe's natural gas prices nearly doubled. In the UK, inflation is projected to breach 5%. The International Energy Agency called this the single largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not the 1970s oil shock. Not the Gulf War. This one. JP Morgan has issued a direct warning. If this blockade continues through the end of April, it will have a massive negative impact on global energy, global food supply, and global finance. Simultaneously, we have not seen all three of those under simultaneous pressure at this scale. Not in living memory. Here's the part of this story that almost no major outlet is connecting properly. China receives a full third of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. 84% of all crude passing through the strait is destined for Asian markets. No country on earth is more exposed to this crisis than Beijing. So you would expect China to be demanding the strait reopen. That is not what is happening. On April 7th, 6 days ago, Russia and China walked into the UN Security Council and vetoed a resolution that would have helped reopen the strait for global shipping. 11 of 15 member nations voted yes. China and Russia said no. Then, one day later, China helped broker a US-Iran ceasefire and positioned itself as the peacemaker. That is not confusion. That is a strategy. Since the strait was closed, Iran has been running what amounts to a financial toll booth. Ships that want limited passage pay transit fees. And those fees, confirmed by at least 2 vessels as of late March, according to Lloyd's list, are being collected not in US dollars, but in Chinese yuan. A Chinese maritime services company is acting as the intermediary. The architecture of a UN-denominated energy corridor is not theoretical. It is already operational. Deutsche Bank economists have warned that this conflict could be the key catalyst for the erosion of petrodollar dominance and the beginning of what they are calling the petro-yuan era. The petrodollar system, born from a US-Saudi deal in 1974, is the reason America can run massive deficits, maintain a global military, and impose sanctions that actually hurt. Harvard economist Kenneth Rogoff told Al Jazeera this week that Iran is completely serious about preferring yuan to avoid us sanctions while cultivating China. To be precise about what is not yet happening, the petrodollar is not dead. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait have not abandoned dollar pricing. China's yuan is still not freely convertible. Beijing's capital controls limit global adoption. But the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has already fallen to a 25-year low, from 71% in 1999 to roughly 57% today. And every day the strait stays closed, that number moves. Now let's talk about what executing this blockade actually requires, because Trump's social media posts and military reality are two very different things. A senior American admiral with direct operational experience in the Strait of Hormuz stated publicly that the minimum required force is 2 aircraft carriers, 12 frigates or destroyers, and the active cooperation of UAE and Saudi Arabian warships. That is the floor, not the ceiling. The problem is what happened to the last 2 carriers sent to this theater. The Abraham Lincoln and the Gerald Ford were both reportedly struck by Iranian missiles during the 40-day war and withdrew to the Arabian Sea. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, also relocated most of its assets away from the Persian Gulf when operations began. Iran's missile and drone capabilities demonstrated they can hit large naval targets with precision. Putting carriers back inside the strait concentrates them as targets. Iran's military preparation for exactly this scenario goes back decades. They have approximately 24 midget submarines, difficult to detect in shallow Gulf waters, acquired from North Korea, with potential technology transfer for local production. These can deploy torpedoes, lay mines, and fire cruise missiles from underwater, using Chinese vetoed satellite navigation. They have smart minds that distinguish between military and commercial vessels, and all of it is coordinated from a central IRGC command headquarters near the strait itself. Add to this Iran's cyber and electronic warfare capabilities, developed with significant Chinese and Russian assistance, and the operational picture becomes even more complex. Iran can potentially disrupt ship-to-ship and ship-to-shore communications, broadcast false GPS signals to redirect vessels into danger, and do so from provincial cyber-electronic command centers established across the country at the start of this year. The same admiral who outlined the force requirements also outlined the risk clearly. If 2 or 3 American destroyers are destroyed in this blockade operation, it is not just ships that are lost. It is American prestige. And prestige in geopolitics is not decorative. It is functional. It determines who other nations call when they need help, and who they ignore. Here is what is not being covered adequately. Even as the blockade went into effect this morning, there are active reports that Iranian and American technical experts, not senior officials, but experts, are expected to meet soon. The agenda: how to manage the strait, and how to resolve the nuclear enrichment question. Mediating countries include Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, and others. The door is not closed. Trump's stated goal is to pressure Iran back to the negotiating table within the 9 remaining days of the current ceasefire. The logic is sound on paper. Squeeze Iran's oil exports, which go 90% to China, and China will pressure Iran to deal. But that assumes China wants Iran to deal on American terms. The evidence from the past 6 weeks suggests Beijing's preference is precisely the opposite. Trump is also scheduled to visit China on May 14th. If the blockade continues and China cannot access Iranian oil, that meeting starts with enormous tension. And China holds leverage that has nothing to do with the strait: rare earth elements, permanent magnets, and tungsten, which China controls 80% of global production capacity for, are all critical inputs for advanced American weapons manufacturing. These are not soft threats. They are supply chain facts. What we are watching is not simply a naval standoff. It is a simultaneous test of American military credibility, the dollar's role as the currency of global trade, China's patience as a long-game strategist, and Iran's ability to withstand pressure that would collapse most economies. All 4 tests are happening at once. The result of each shapes the outcome of the others. 3 scenarios are now in play simultaneously. First, talks succeed. Technical experts find a framework within 9 days. The ceasefire holds. The strait gradually reopens. Oil prices stabilize. Second, the blockade holds but talks fail. Prices breach $150 a barrel. Food and fuel crises deepen across the developing world. Iran and China accelerate the yuan energy corridor. Third, escalation. Iran acts on its threat. Regional ports face disruption. A U.S. vessel is struck. Prestige calculations change everything. For you personally, what happens in the next 2 weeks determines whether energy and food costs continue rising or begin to stabilize. It determines whether the dollar remains the foundation of global trade, or whether a slow crack becomes a visible fracture. And it determines whether the United States can enforce a military blockade against a nation that has spent decades specifically preparing to resist one. For you personally, What happens in the next 2 weeks determines whether energy and food costs continue rising or begin to stabilize. It determines whether the dollar remains the foundation of global trade, or whether a slow crack becomes a visible fracture. And it determines whether the United States can enforce a military blockade against a nation that has spent decades specifically preparing to resist one.